Hey, good morning. It's July 17th, 2022 at approximately 10:30 my time. And mine's in a really interesting spot right now. A lot of things coming together in a very profound way, some of which I thought I'd share with you this morning. Millions of people are attending their houses of worship today. And, I've always considered, in fact, I considered a lot of this last night, ironically, while watching episode 7 of season 4 of Stranger Things. And simultaneously, I just happened to be online because I was interested in Dante's Inferno, the incredible poem otherwise known as the Divine Comedy. And as I'm watching, Stranger Things and everything that it's, you know, basically projecting, as well as kind of understanding the 9 levels of hell that's projected in Dante's Inferno, otherwise known as the Divine Comedy, which interestingly enough was written between I think 1318 and 1321, during the Renaissance, the 300 years between 1300 and 1600. A lot of really profound introspection by a lot of artists and poets and all aspects of human society, really searching for purpose and meaning and trying to reform a lot of things that took place during the Dark Ages, which was really, a long period of a lot of really bad aspects of humanity, and death and suffering and those sorts of things that came with the Black Plague and all of the chaos that came with it. And, I was thinking about all of this stuff in context to, people going to their houses of worships and how they might actually spend their time on Sundays, for example. And I thought, I wonder what kind of percentage of people get super, I don't know, immersed in their thoughts and their connection to God and their thoughts of like eternal consequences, whether it's damnation or bliss, and everything that constitutes in terms of someone trying to, evaluate their value and their purpose at whatever stage of the game they're on, and then contrast that with, a lot of other people that do what people do, right? They probably look around the congregation and wonder what other people are thinking, what they're doing, who they belong with, who they want to be seen with, what people perceive about them. And, that contradiction in terms of what people do in a particular setting like that really kind of brings to mind a lot of these questions that Dante projects in this incredible Odyssey, in which he, with a colleague, go through these 9 layers of hell to understand the nature and magnitude of our actions in this life. And in the deepest rungs of hell were circle 8 and circle 9. And circle 8 is all about fraud and deception. And circle 9 is all about treachery or treason. And those were above, quite frankly, murder, which I think was the 7th circle of hell. And I found that fascinating because it correlates to a lot of stuff that I've, really been educated about in the past several years, because I continue to think of the hierarchy of society. I think of the things that constitute how consequences happen in our internal lives, our internal struggle, and of course that of society as a whole. And when we look around at all the things that I've been bringing to you for some time, and how it plays out and what people can connect with and how they interpret things, it's extraordinary to me to consider that, a lot of what I'm thinking about are the types of things that Dante was thinking about in the 1300s. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of my mind was just on overdrive, just trying to, piece together and figure out all of these things that are revealing themselves to basically be the information that decodes, whatever it is to unlock your mind, right? The code to unlock your mind. Because, yeah, I've been in this really interesting place for a very long time because of this journey that I've gone on that's taken me literally 13 years, from my collapse in 2008 and all of the turmoil that it brought to me from the housing collapse, and the journey went to piece together, all of the questions that didn't make sense, and then ultimately be in a situation now, that many years later, and looking back and all of the things that I've gone through and kind of contextualizing it within this whole sort of fresco of life. And To that point, another thing that popped up on my radar this morning, which I think is incredibly relevant, was this front page article in the Salt Lake Tribune, which was about affordable housing. And what they framed is this incredible growth and gentrification in the city of Salt Lake City, which is quite frankly the same type of activity that's taking place in cities like Portland and Boise and Phoenix primarily, Vegas always, not as much as Phoenix in the Southwest, but Austin. Those are kind of like the places in the last, I don't know, let's call it 8 years that have just been exploding. And a lot of that has come from everything that took place during COVID. And there's a lot of highly paid people in the tech sector in California that are getting sick of homelessness and the high prices and high taxes and everything else. And because of technology, they can go work in other places and they can find better buys in, other states and everything else, which has led to this just unbelievable growth, or at least that's what's presumed. Now, what I've been explaining to you through my truth bombs, which, on it today is basically a sermon, given everything that I'm talking about, is what everybody doesn't seem to understand is what, of course, we unpack in the con, which is the motherlode of the whole contextualization of truth. And it was on display full stop this weekend. How? Why? President Biden goes and meets with MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, 36 years old, I believe, and in the context of the power of Saudi within the world's appetite for oil and, of course, inflation and the costs and everything else. And the whole idea is that, Biden's going to go make a deal to try to bring down, costs here at home. Now, for those who understand domestic drilling capacity and all of the other things, they're mad at Biden for one reason. And then, of course, all of the, the critics with the human rights sort of scenario want to bring up, and this is the thing that got me in mainstream media, and it just absolutely boggles my mind that this is even a possibility, but it was on display over and over and over, which is, they want to talk about Khashoggi and MBS ordering the murder of Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who happened, like I've said in previous Truth Bombs, was the nephew of the world's largest arm dealer for several decades, and who happened to have ties to Trump, but that's another story. And, they're talking about Khashoggi and human rights violations and this, like, oh my God, the shock of, creating a scenario where, Saudi are these villains and they're not accepted in the global arena. And that's kind of the, let's call it the elitist liberal approach, Ivy League approach, guys behind the scenes, Wall Street and everything else that like to puppeteer all this stuff. That's what they want us to think, right? Meanwhile, what about the turmoil and the devastation and everything that goes along with the families of 9/11? We're not talking about them. We're not talking about Saudi's role in 9/11. We're not talking about Dick Cheney's role in 9/11, the intelligence failures that were actually predetermined, and other things that go with that in the last 20 years that have devastated the lives of probably tens of millions, but at least it led to the deaths of over 1 million people in all of these different conflicts, not to mention everything that happened on 9/11 itself. So that's one part of the equation. But what's the most important part of the equation of that is that the dollar, our currency, our global hegemony, our status as the global reserve currency, is pretty much predicated on oil, and it has been since 1971 when we got off the gold standard, which became the oil standard. What's the other part of the equation? Well, the other part of the equation is what that enables us to do. Now, for example, right after 9/11, the United States economy was in a tailspin. We were about to hit a massive recession and all other things that were happening along those lines. And so as we were getting ready for response in Afghanistan and then ultimately the invasion of Iraq, for all of the different things that materializes and manifests, the other side of the equation was, and not too many people are aware of this, but Alan Greenspan went literally, I think the week of 9/11, and the first thing he did, and he was the former chair of the Federal Reserve, the first thing he did was he went to the Suez Canal to make sure the flow of oil wasn't going to be jammed up. Why might that be? Well, it should show you the importance of Saudi as the swing producer and the free flow of oil to basically fuel this giant hegemony that we've created in this neoliberal empire over the course of 4 decades. I think it really starts, this particular era starts in the late 60s, and really runs on overdrive. I mean, it starts to ramp up in the late 70s, 80s was huge, and 2022 is the consequence of it all. And so what does that mean? Well, we have global dependence on oil. 75% of the world's economy is dominated by oil and all of its facets. I mean, chemical, all the different variables, especially plastics. And, it's not just for fuel consumption. I mean, there's just household goods, manufacturing, pesticides, you name it. There's so much are tied to, the fossil fuel-based global economy. And, one of my theories in terms of why, 9/11 was so important to the establishment was that it just perpetuated this dependence, this global dependence on oil, when we have the technology to pivot to a new paradigm because of all of the given technological advancements in renewable energies. All we really need at this stage of the game is a complete reboot on the infrastructure for the grid. That's the most important thing. We could talk about fuel and transportation for airlines and rocket fuel and all that other kind of stuff, and put in the back of your mind hydrogen. But all of that is just secondary to, like I said, the hegemony of oil, which is the hegemony of the dollar, which then fuels everything that we revealed in the con. Because Alan Greenspan, when the United States went into the recession early 2001, because of all of this stuff, suddenly we created 0% interest, low interest that fueled the housing market, and it created all this speculation and all of this insane deception because of what we got rid of in the late 90s, which were the 3 Ds that I've taught you before: deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. And that created the housing market. And so suddenly we replaced, our industrial capacity because we had already farmed it out overseas, and you've got most of our manufacturing in Asia, and a lot of our fuel needs are energy demands from the Middle East that undergirds the American dollar as the global hegemony currency. And then ultimately, we put that into our own consumption, our own build of the housing industry, which we created, unfortunately, liar's loans that were there to fuel demand of $70 trillion of global investment capital that we built around the world because of offshoring and outsourcing everything that we used to do in the United States to other countries. That money actually came back to the United States in the form of investment that created warehouse lines to fuel the housing bubble. And the housing bubble used liar's loans, all sorts of deceptive acts and practices to be able to get loans, and people in the houses who couldn't afford them didn't understand what they were doing, refinance based on stuff that they didn't understand, all of which is on display in the con at www.thecon.tv. The bubble expanded. Both oil, by the way, got to all-time highs in 2007. And then ultimately the housing market and everything was up. Everybody was living on credit. Everybody's living on debt. They're not living on revenue. They're living on credit and debt. And then suddenly the bubble pops. Everything comes crashing down. Oil prices went down. Housing market went obliterated. And then the foreclosures, the tsunami of foreclosures came. Now, what I've been revealing to you this whole time is we had liar's loans the whole time that composed of liar securities, that liar debt, liar's derivatives. You can't, basically create gold through alchemy from coal. It just doesn't work that way, okay? And the nature of this whole system, when it collapsed, our financial system went bankrupt. But the whole thing was predicated on fraud the whole time. Lies, deception, cheating, everything that went with it, everything that's on display in the con. There was many different levels of this, which instantly brings me full circle to Dante's Inferno, the 9 levels of hell, the 9 circles of hell. But I'll come back to that just in a minute, though, because I want to finish up this notion of what I'm getting to and what everybody's missing and what it is that I'm telling you that is the truth of everything. That's basically recreated the system we lived in over the course of the last 13 years. It's never been done before in history. We had, under Federal Reserve Act 13.3, this incredible ability by the Federal Reserve, built on its currency being the global hegemony, the global currency, was able to digitize into existence a massive relief to the financial industry to create liquidity. in markets around the world and in banks and financial centers, sectors, I should say. So that liquidity started in the form of the massive bailouts in 2009 to the tune of $29 trillion. You've heard me say that before. $29 trillion. To put it into perspective, I think this James Webb telescope that took 30 years to design, and with all the greatest scientific minds in the world, to be able to look back into the heavens that we just launched 1,000,000 miles away from Earth, to get these incredible composite imagery of the beginning of time, which goes back 13.5 billion years, to understand the very beginning of our universe. That project alone was billions and billions of dollars. I mean, the magnitude of the NASA budget is like $600 billion a year, I think. No, I'm sure it's much less than that. I got that wrong, because the United States military budget is like 650 to 700 and some odd $billion a year. NASA itself is probably quite a bit less than that, which means that grand achievement of the James Webb Telescope was monumentally less. Again, to remind you, we're talking in 2009, we spent $29 trillion to basically prop up the financial market that had gone bankrupt. They were bankrupt. All of the biggest financial institutions in the United States, because of all of the different layers and ingredients of this financial fraud that we unveil in the con, for all the reasons that we unveil it, created this absolute global disaster, of which the people that created the disaster got $29 trillion at that time period to rebuild the system. But did they rebuild the system to make it work the way it was supposed to? No, because there was no accountability. None of the CEOs, through control fraud, that created these grand grifts that lied, stole, and deceived the American people, ultimately required the full faith and credit of the United States to backstop their fraud. Incredible. Now let's go back to the 13th century, 13, 18, 13, 19, 14th century of Dante, when he's thinking about the 9 circles of hell. The lowest depths of depravity in his expression at that time, because he understood power, was fraud and grift at circle number 8, and treason at number 9. And he's right, because if you invert that, it's absolute power that corrupts absolutely. That's what we talk about when we talk about when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. Pretty freaking astounding when you consider it. And then again, when you go back to the very beginning of what the James Webb Telescope is revealing, 13.5 billion years ago, was literally from what we've experienced since is infinity in the heavens, in the universe, right? Infinity. But it literally came from singularity. I think matter in something that was much smaller, from what I understand, than even atoms, subatomic particles. And this going back to what many people are probably start with, quite frankly, in their sort of unpacking of the universe by way of what their religion informs. I mean, wasn't it that God said, "Let there be light"? I mean, in that dramatic of fashion, I mean, that's what the Big Bang is. Let there be light. Boom! Infinity, right? And that leads to the 13th century, and then, man's sort of interpretation of how things work and the layers of depravity and hell and its deception and fraud and treason. That's at the highest of the order of betrayal to, I guess, God. That's that idea. And I find it very fascinating in context to everything that we're dealing with, because we've, again, don't lose sight of what I'm telling you, that we spent trillions upon trillions of dollars to backstop fraud and gift. We incentivized fraud and gift. We made fraud and grift the power structure of the United States. And was that the end of it? Did we suddenly clean up everything and get our act together and everything work out the way it was supposed to, based on liberty and justice for all and the integrity of law? No, absolutely not. We doubled down. We created more grift. We stuck another $19 trillion into backstopping a derivatives run in 2019. And then we had the CARES Act, and a lot of it went to backstopping corporate monopolies, quite frankly. I mean, all of this is just the opposite of supply and demand and free markets and, quite frankly, creative destruction. Going back to the idea of interestingly, black holes, dark matter, and light. God, let there be light. And so, where I'm coming from through this whole thing, and what I'm, I guess, just trying to trigger in your mind, and to bring it full circle to the Salt Lake article this morning about the problem with housing and the problem with affordable housing, and they attribute it to gentrification and other people moving here from places like San Francisco, where there's all of this incredible growth, hyper growth, which presumably is based on free markets, but it's not. It's not. They don't get it. Nobody gets it. We're the only ones who have demonstrated it. And I'm the only one that's bringing it to you straight and trying to codify it in ways that you actually understand so that you can dive in. We created a fraudulent economy, backstopped by the full faith and the credit of the United States. Now, I don't speak for God. I can only kind of interpret what I've read in Dante's Nine Circles of Hell, which he calls the Divine Comedy. Better known, I think most people call it Dante's Inferno, but what an amazing way to frame this, right? The Divine Comedy. I mean, it's funny that the victims in 99% of the country refuses to understand the grift that has destroyed and continues to destroy their life for the benefit of the few at their expense. Now, I don't want to, blame the top 10% because I've said this before in some of my truth bombs, but a lot of the people in the top 10% that didn't get taken out by the 2008 downturn, who've always lived responsibly, that had income, that could afford, what they purchased, managed their money correctly, never got so far into debt that they went bankrupt, unlike the grifter in chief, Trump, who has lied and deceived everybody who would be in Dante's, nine circle of hell, because he literally is the definition of treason. But is he the only one, given what I'm talking about? That's what happens when the system runs awry. Dr. Phil Zimbardo, the professor emeritus at Stanford University, says that's the Lucifer effect. I find that very fitting, all things considered. I hope you guys have a great Sunday. I hope that somehow, some way, that this truth penetrates your mind, and then you become, I hate to say it, but a Baptist in this sort of corollary to tell people it's all a fucking lie. It's all a lie. And the longer we go where we let that lie exist within our own minds and our refusal to understand it, the longer this system continues to do what it does. The outcome will not be good. For those of you who can manifest and understand how all of this stuff is supposed to work because you lead good lives, you lead lives where your actions are aligned with your principles, and you have dignity and you have integrity, it's you who have to align with me and everybody that I'm trying to bring to the fore to be able to push back and purge corruption. Corruption will be the end of our time period, as it has so many others throughout history. Onwards and upwards.